Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, episode 197.
Welcome back to Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast. Today I'm here with Sam Clements. Sam, how are you?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
Great. In the middle of this COVID lockdown thing, are you and your family okay there?
Yes, we are. Everybody is safe and sound, if not a little on the stir-crazy side.
Well, you do have a huge backyard.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
And a wife who likes puttering in the garden, so she can at least go out there and play.
Yes.
And I heard you also have a bounce house in your house.
Yeah, that makes an appearance every once in a while when the kids get particularly rambunctious and the weather is bad. We have just enough space, although it was the cause of quite the goose egg on the little girl's forehead the other day. She was bouncing a little too fervishly and ended up hitting some furniture.
So is the bounce house outside now?
No, it's still inside. We don't learn our lessons very well.
The second time she gets hurt, that will be it. I thought I'd have you join me today on this podcast to announce a new series that we're going to do together about rules to follow when designing wireless LANs.
And when to break them.
So what we're going to be doing in this series is I'm going to come up with a rule, some sort of best practice rule. Like all rules, they're made to be broken. I'll go through the part of why I think it's a rule that we should follow. And then
I will talk about why it should be broken, or when it should be broken, or something like that.
And if we don't always agree on everything, which is totally fine, but it'll allow our listeners to have a little back and forth and a little understanding of that there is a rule, but sometimes it's okay to break those. In an upcoming episode, you'll have an actual rule and when to break it. Thanks for your time today, Sam.
Likewise.
Wireless LAN Professionals is a place to educate, inform, encourage, and entertain those involved in wireless LANs. This Wireless LAN Professionals podcast is an audio manifestation of these goals. Our host is a wireless LAN veteran, consultant, designer, and teacher, Keith Parsons. And now, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals.
Today I have with me Gabriel Dejardin. How'd I do on that last name there?
So it's in French, it's Dejardin.
Well, that sounds way better. So we'll just go with that. Well, Gabriel, glad you could join us. And you're with Broadcom. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Broadcom?
Sure, absolutely. I work for one of Broadcom's 3 Wi-Fi divisions. This is the mobile wireless division. We make Wi-Fi and Bluetooth products for primarily smartphones. So we make low power Wi-Fi and Bluetooth for battery power applications. I'm the head of product for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth in that division. I focus primarily on Wi-Fi and Bluetooth innovation, trying to figure out our roadmap for the next few years.
What are the other 2 divisions that do with Wi-Fi?
We have an access division. So it's a broadband cable access division. So that's focused on access points. So if you buy DSL router or PON router or just a standalone Wi-Fi access point, that's what that division builds. And then we have a set-top box division, and they have their own Wi-Fi parts that attach to cable set-top boxes.
Do you have separate designs for each of those divisions, or how much of that do you share between each of you?
Historically, it all came from the same core, the same IP. And over time, as the divisions have grown, they're a bit too big for everything to all have been bundled under a single division. So the divisions have been split up a little bit, but the core IP came from the same place. All the people who work on the Wi-Fi designs have worked together for going on 20 years. Fundamentally, it's all the same thing, even if there's some financial delineation between the groups that are working on things.
And how long have you been working in this mobile division?
I have been there for 10 years.
Oh, so you've seen lots of changes.
I have. I came in and we had not yet contemplated our first 802.11ac products. My first big assignment was to take on the 802.11ac mobile product line. I worked for many years as the product manager for that product line, and gradually that morphed into Wi-Fi 6, now Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7.
About how far out, I don't want to ask anything that you can't share, but about how far out is your work before it actually hits the consumer that they can put it in their hand?
Sort of a mix. I work on products that are shipping today, probably extending out to about a 5-year time horizon. At this point, I'd be looking at 2020 through 2025.
So that's a pretty long time horizon to be contemplating. And yet, if you don't start early, there's a lot of work to get things done.
Absolutely. Start to finish, I think it probably takes at least 36 months to productize a new chip. So you need to spend quite some time prior to that 36-month time period, figuring out what it is that you want to build.
Well, all of the previous, well, at least since you've been there, we've had 5 gigahertz and 2.4. The chip manufacturers knew that the spectrum was from 2.412 up to the whole range that was available. You made the radios work in that. When did you, as a broader team, think of, we're going to need to go to more spectrum?
Well, I think there's been a long-standing push for that. For a long time, we tried to figure out ways to enable more spectrum in 5 gigahertz.
Like some of the Uni 2B or something, we thought, oh, look at that, smack in the middle of what we want. Yeah, that didn't work out so well.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like, what are some of the things that you can do to open up some of the radar channels? Can you add another radio that sits there and performs all of the listening tasks required to get a DFS channel allocation? Can you use an adjacent device in the same room to get you your DFS allocation? Can we get DFS to run on mobile? There was a lot of work where we're kind of twisting ourselves in knots, trying to figure out how to get access to the spectrum in 5 gigahertz that can be a bit of a challenge to get to. So that's been going on for years and years and years and years. I mean, that's basically been happening almost as long as I can remember at Broadcom. I don't really know the exact timing or genesis of it. At some point, this whole idea of having devices operate in the 6 gigahertz spectrum really took shape.
From my standpoint, we were trying to use contiguous band, which would have made life much easier. So that was the first pass, and it didn't quite go through. So we went looking for more spectrum, and amazingly, the 6 gig worked. After years of practice, we're now recording this about a week or so after the FCC announced that in the US we'll have 1200 megahertz of new frequency up in 6 gig. How long have you been working in that? I mean, it was predicted it was going to happen. So I'm sure you've been at this for quite some time.
We've had a sense that the 6 gigahertz band will eventually open up, and a lot of people working on that process at Broadcom. I would say that we probably identified 6 gigahertz as a capability in our products back in 2017 sometime. We started talking to customers about how this was going to be an eventuality.
And you picked the winning horse, and it is. So what does that mean from a hardware standpoint? Though 5 gig and 6 gig are close, can you reuse a lot of the same parts that you had before? What are the things you had to think about as you went and put both those two together?
One of the interesting things that we've done, as we've moved from 802.11ac to Wi-Fi 6 and now to Wi-Fi 6E, we've actually done a process node transition in each of those steps. So we did most of our 802.11ac work in a 40 nanometer process. We did our initial Wi-Fi 6 work in a 28 nanometer process, and Wi-Fi 6E and 16 nanometer. And so the good thing about making that transition, which obviously takes a lot of investment and effort and work to get to productization, is that it's a very good time to go back to the drawing board and re-architect for an optimal radio performance. If we were sitting in the same process, there'd be a challenge. You'd have to go back and do a lot of work to add these extra bands. But here, because we were opening everything up and starting from scratch, it made it a lot easier to go and add a bunch of different spectrum, because that was on the drawing board from day one.
Does that mean that the same radio can do everything from the low end of 5 gig all the way up to the low end of 7?
Correct. Probably there's some capability. The lowest frequency is the Japan band. Probably still support for that band in there, and then all the way up to 7.2 gigahertz.
Impressive. So when people say, is this a single radio, dual radio, or tri-radio, really, the 5 gig to 7 is just one radio.
Correct.
Yeah, and since you're on the mobile side, on the AP side, we have a whole bunch of different designs depending on who the market is, whether it's a SOHO market or enterprise, and if it's a transition. In the mobile space, and I'll just pick an iPhone. I'm sure there's Android phones will be the same. Well, we have phones of the future that can do everything from the low-end cellular, depending where they are in the world, to 2.4, CBRS in the middle, 5 and 6, all on the same phone.
Yes, absolutely. There are obviously multiple different architectures that you could come up with, multiple different radio architectures that you could come up with. But cell phones in particular are extremely size constrained and cost constrained. And so the optimal solution for that space is to have a dedicated single radio that operates in 5 and 6 gigahertz because of it being contiguous spectrum. That turns out to be the main driver behind the architecture in that space. In access points where you have a little bit more space on your platform, You have a little bit more freedom in terms of cost, where Wi-Fi is really the key feature of those platforms. There can be a little bit more flexibility in terms of architecture. And you already have tri-band routers. It's a sort of a trivial modification to make those tri-band routers into 2.4, 5, and 6 on each of those 3 bands.
Thinking about the insides of a phone, of a mobile phone, there's radios, and radios have associated antennas. Is that something that Broadcom does? Do you recommend certain antenna pairings with your radios, or is that something the vendors do on their own and you just pick it up from the antenna side?
There was a time where we drove a little bit of the antenna design, but that's so long ago. It's not really something we do anymore. Once you got to a point where you needed 4 cellular antennas inside a phone, industrial design and antenna design became an incredibly complex process that really needed a lot of specialization at any OEM that's going to build a phone. So it's not the kind of thing that you could ever really leave up to any of your vendors, because you have this need to balance out antenna gain and antenna isolation between each of the different subsystems. That's something that's become very, very challenging design task and a real area of specialization for smartphone OEMs.
It is quite a difficult thing. Every one of them has a different frequency, which means they have a different optimum size, and they're not the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to figure out how you can combine different subsystems to use the same antenna. If you put UWB in your phone, is that going to be combined with 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi? How will you combine LAA with 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi? You have a ton of questions of that nature. So there's a lot of complexity in terms of industrial design, antenna design, front-end design, filter design. It's really a huge challenge. It's a massive, massive solution space, I guess you would say, to come and figure this out. And I think I knew it was probably maybe 8 or 9 years ago. I went to talk to a friend of mine who was a cellular and RF architect. And he had this sheet of paper sitting down in front of him that had what looked to me like 56 different bands with tons of filters, amplifiers, antennas. I was just blown away by the complexity of what he was imagining. And he said, hey, this is just what a standard phone is going to look like in a couple of years. I think at that point, I knew that whatever we could contribute on the Wi-Fi side, we were going to have to cut it off at the output of our PAs and hand it off to somebody else.
Let them deal with that on the other side.
Absolutely.
I know years ago, we used to be able to get a cell phone that could do FM as well as Wi-Fi and GPS. How many of those other features, because you just mentioned UWB, that's just one of many other radio things that are happening inside these little handheld computers. Where do you do the handoff within your chip design from what's Wi-Fi, what's cellular, what's neither of those? Or is that all inside of a single chip?
So we have had a lot of different technologies at Broadcom over the years, and we've tried to do all kinds of different combinations. We sell a lot of GNSS products. We've tried to do combo devices with GNSS. We had FM in a lot of products. We had NFC. So we pulled all of those subsystems into an overall combo chip with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. But ultimately what we found is the smartphone OEMs want a little bit more flexibility in terms of how they build GNSS and NFC, where they place those within the phone. And there's obviously not as much uptake on FM anymore as there used to be. Things have kind of been narrowed down to Wi-Fi plus Bluetooth. Cellular has always been a separate subsystem. I've seen lots and lots and lots of proposals to go and combine the radios, combine the basebands, and nobody has ever really done this in a meaningful way. Some other vendors may do a different partition between radio and baseband than we do, but ultimately Wi-Fi and Bluetooth have kind of found a space where they are most naturally isolated together away from the other wireless products.
That does allow you to focus at least on only those two you have to deal with. In your world, with the mobile world, battery life is paramount. Unlike the enterprise access point side, they're always plugged in. What kind of trade-offs do you have to make in design when you look at that battery usage?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that we introduced many, many years ago was the concept of offloads. there used to be a notion that every function needed to take up some MIPS on a main applications processor or SoC. And we basically developed a software architecture where a lot of activities, scanning, for example, or whitelisting, long list of things were completely offloaded to our device. And so the whole rest of the phone was off and only our device is on. Obviously our power is going to be significantly less in a lower end, low clock speed, single core ARM versus some 4, 8, 12 core big SoC somewhere. So that's a first place. The second thing is we go and we design around the modes that our customers end up using most of the time. So we optimize for how their products are actually used. If you're building an access point, you spend a lot of time transmitting, you spend some amount of time receiving. You really need to spend time optimizing your PAs. But a PA is basically trying to drive power into a 50 ohm load. As a lot of people say, you're limited by physics there. There's only so much you can do. On the phone side, you spend most of your time listening. We brought in a lot of innovations in our receivers to lower the power consumption that we use while we're listening to the media. We've really driven that power down. So that really gives our customers the longest possible battery life while using Wi-Fi. The critical observation was that's the main mode that the phone operates in. And the critical design decision is to go and optimize that power consumption.
Since your chips are doing Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and both of those happen simultaneously, how do they go about sharing the antenna that listens to both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth at the same time? You can be obviously on the phone and listening to music, your headset on, all at the same time.
This is something we've been working on for over a decade. For the most part there, you are not operating simultaneously. You give some amount of time to Bluetooth, and then you give some amount of time to Wi-Fi, and you go back and forth. And unless there's some pressing operation that one or the other subsystem needs to complete, you simply cycle back and forth. That ends up behaving pretty well. I think the key observation there is just that you need to have a different set of rules for cycling back and forth, whether you're listening to stereo audio on Bluetooth, you're doing a phone call, or you're using a keyboard or a mouse or some kind of Bluetooth LE controller. We've gone down a path of just optimizing for all those different configurations with the way that you want to use Wi-Fi as well.
And does that change dynamically if I have the same phone, but I connect up a mouse to it? Is it now adjust that algorithm accordingly?
Obviously, there's a different perception of latency when you're using a mouse or a keyboard versus when you're listening to audio. Similarly, Bluetooth phone calls, for example, are extremely unforgiving in terms of losing time slot and when the medium must be available. Compare that to human interface device, which gives you a lot greater lag in terms of when you actually have to respond to it.
Or comparing to an email download.
Yeah.
You don't even have to worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, Wi-Fi as well is very forgiving, right? You have a lot of situations where you'll tolerate very large fluctuations in your instantaneous Wi-Fi throughput. We can make a lot of intelligent decisions around what kind of throughput we're going to allow given the priority of the Bluetooth packets and how the user is going to perceive that Bluetooth behavior.
I'm just intrigued with this time slicing that you're actually popping back and forth between Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on the same infrastructure. And the way you discuss it, it's like it's a really long time. But these are very, very short slices that you're talking about.
Yes, they're extremely, extremely short slices. If you look at a phone call, you've got extremely short periods of time, extremely short slots, hundreds of milliseconds to switch back and forth. If you're looking at a keyboard, you may have a little bit more time. It's time slicing in very, very small periods of time.
And I can just see you sitting around in a conference room talking to people about these like they actually exist in human time, when as a human, you could do all of that switching back and forth before we even notice.
Yeah.
But then again, I see that also in your chip manufacturer, that when you were talking about the nanometer size, we can't even imagine how small that is. And yet you went, oh yeah, and we got it this much smaller.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly not something that's visible to the naked eye or really meaningfully perceptible to people. The only thing that probably makes sense in a macro sense is how big the chip is. And so, We started out with functionality that might require 40 square millimeters. We were able to drive it down to 20 square millimeters and then add a bunch of functionality and still end up at a smaller die size. And that's the kind of thing you can see with the naked eye, but anything below that is microscopic.
And yet we talk about it like we talk about, oh yeah, it goes this and it slices over there and it goes down this little path, when they're just invisible and unperceptible to humans.
Yeah.
We have to do that in order to make them and do what they're doing. You've been obviously working for years now on 6 gig. Didn't know exactly when it was going to be approved, both in the US and worldwide. When can we start expecting to see chips that actually end up in product that we can go and buy and talk 6 gig? Or the way the Wi-Fi Lance calls it, 6E.
Broadcom has announced a broad portfolio of Wi-Fi 6E products. Other companies have as well. We ran an interop trial with Intel a couple months ago. We all have these Wi-Fi 6E products in the pipe. I think you'll start to see the first products in the market in Q4 of this year, access points. They have a faster time to market, so they can pick up Wi-Fi 6E chips today and start shipping them. I think in terms of seeing a phone, you'll be waiting until early 2021, but you'll see a full ecosystem in less than a year. You'll be able to have a full Wi-Fi 6E ecosystem in your home very, very soon.
That's pretty impressive. I've seen a presentation by someone from Broadcom last year about how they're going to use the different bands in houses. We normally in the wireless LAN professionals and our audience deal with more of the enterprise class, but there's a huge market out there for the Soho class that could use maybe 6 gig as the mesh or as a backhaul and then still leave the clients on the different side. So I think we're going to see a lot of different options coming in the next year.
Well, it's funny. I never really thought about this all that much until I ended up working at home for the last couple of months along with my wife. And I have a number of different networks set up in my home. I moved her laptop and all of her devices onto one network, and I put mine on a different channel because we're running into significant bandwidth limitations when we're running on the same AP or even the same mesh network.
I think that's going to change for a lot of us as we move into 6 gig. Well, Gabe, thanks for your time. I appreciate you sharing a little of your information and knowledge about how chips are done, and especially from the mobile client side.
Sure, absolutely. And you or anyone else, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is Behind the Net, and I'm happy to answer any question anybody has about Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or really any other wireless technology or professional sports anytime anybody has a question.
That's great. We'll add your link in the show notes and hope to talk to you soon.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me on. Great talking to you guys. Great to meet you guys.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Wireless LAN Professionals Podcast, the podcast for wireless LAN professionals by wireless LAN professionals. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Wireless LAN Pros for all the latest news and updates, and also connect directly with Keith on Twitter at Keith R. Parsons. Head over to www.wlanpros.com for this episode's show notes, as well as the latest in all things Wi-Fi.